If we remember yesterday was November 11th. 105 years ago, on November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m. Central European Time, which would be Paris time, the armistice was declared between the Allies and Germany, effectively ending in World War I. We're going to switch gears today and zoom in and look at conscious objectors in the country of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This map shows that, a picture of that. So we're going to first look at a couple verses on loving our enemies, and then I'm just going to go into the sermon. This is just a refresher for us. So we remember these verses. It says, Matthew chapter 5, these are verses 10, 11, and 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Skipping down a little further into the chapter, verses 43 and 44. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. And we're going to skip to another passage dealing with this. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 and 5. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So one of the people we're going to be talking about this morning is this person. His name was Herbert Asquith. He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain from April 5th, 1908 to December 5th, 1916. So we're going to look, just a brief refresher of how Great Britain became involved in World War I. As I said, in the past we looked at what happened in the United States. Today we're focusing on Great Britain. They had conscious objectors just like we did. So, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie of Austria are murdered in Sarajevo by a radical Serbian nationalist. And then Austria-Hungary declares an ultimatum on Serbia, which Serbia rejects. Austria-Hungary declares war against Serbia on July 28, 1914. Then Russia, having ties to Serbia, then mobilizes and they declare war. Then Germany declares a war on Russia on August 1st, 1914. August 3rd, 1914, Germany declares war on France, which is the catalyst. If you just look back at that map, it says you can't tell, but here's France, and then Germany, and then that little tiny country right there is Belgium. And it was the quickest for Germany to come through Belgium. So Belgium had signed a treaty guaranteeing its neutrality. And Germany, Austria, Russia, France, and Great Britain were all guarantors of that treaty. So this is now August 4th, 1914, which was a Tuesday. And Germany had just started invading Belgium. Britain issues an ultimatum to Germany in the morning, giving them 12 hours to respond to guarantee Belgium's neutrality, which Germany ignores. So at 11 p.m. August 4th, Britain declares war. And here's what the newspaper says. That's called the Westerham Herald. This is the Great British newspaper, dated Saturday, August 8th, 1914. We're going to zoom into this little clip right here, and we'll just read it. It says, the reply was demanded by midnight, and the following announcement was issued at the Foreign Office at 12:15 a.m. Owing to the summary rejection by the German government of the request made by His Majesty's government for assurances that the neutrality of Belgium would be respected, His Majesty's ambassador in Berlin has received his passport, and His Majesty's government has declared to the German government that a state of war exists between Great Britain and Germany as from 11 p.m. on August 4th. When I looked at that, I said, that's terrible. We just declared war. But that's not what Great Britain thought. That same newspaper said the same evening, look at that, it says popular feeling. This is that same evening. We'll read that thing. Patriotic feeling in England and the Empire was now running high. In Trafalgar Square, thousands of people waved flags and made repeated attempts, not always successful, to sing the national anthem, which would be God Save the King at this time period, because they had King George V. Hundreds of people climbed upon the plinth of the Nelson column, and the King Charles statue was almost entirely hid by swarming figures. And we'll just zoom down to the bottom for a second. As soon as the knowledge that war had been declared became known, excited crowds assembled in various parts of the West End, cheering and singing patriotic songs. Buckingham Palace, from half an hour after midnight till well into the small hours of the morning, was the center of attraction for a huge concourse of people, all extremely enthusiastic, many of them clamoring for the appearance of the king. That's not the reaction I would have when I just, like I said, heard war was declared. Well, what happened then? What made different in Great Britain at this time period than all the other countries that were involved in World War I is Great Britain did not have a draft immediately. The United States, when it came into the war in 1917, Russia, Germany, and France all had a draft almost immediately. Great Britain did not. This is one of the most famous posters of that time period. Lord Kitchener, who was the Secretary of State for War, this is his enlistment poster. Just giving you how it's different. Great Britain at the time of World War I had approximately 700,000 men, which sounds like a big army. But Germany, once war was declared, had 3.8 million men drafted, almost 4 times bigger. France had 3.7 million. Russia started with an army of approximately 1.4 million, and when they declared war, they put a draft, and it became close to maybe 4 to 5 million. There's not exact numbers. So Great Britain having an army of 700,000 men is very small in compared. So, like I said, they put this poster out. Let's just read it. Lord Kitchener says, "Men, material, and money are the immediate necessities. Does the call of duty find no response in you until reinforced? Let us rather say, superseded by the call of compulsion." And as I said, there was this ultra-patriotic thing in Great Britain, just like we had in the United States. There's another one. England expects every man to do his duty and join the army today. Here's a picture from London on August 1914 with the rush of all the men who were recruits going to the recruiting station. It is estimated that approximately 30,000 men a day joined the British Army in like August 1914, which is a considerable amount of men to join voluntarily. They were not, there was no draft. They voluntarily joined the army. Like I said, because of these posters. Here's a picture of another newspaper clipping from the Manchester Guardian talking about that. Bringing new armies into being. Response to Lord Kitchener's appeal, first 100,000 men now training. They even thought, there was at least a little bit of thinking that World War I would only be a couple months, be done sometime that fall, early winter. That's a common thinking, which we know didn't happen. In World War I, as we remember, Britain and France and Germany got stuck there, more or less right there where Belgium and eastern France is and western Germany. That's where they had the trenches, hundreds of miles of trenches. That was very early on. So they couldn't do anything, because of the stalemate. Great Britain lost approximately 96,000 casualties in that first 6 months. Like I said, they didn't have a very big army yet. At the same time period, I'm going to talk about this entity that plays a major role in Great Britain. I'm not going to go in a lot of detail, but it plays a major role. It was founded in November 1914. It was called the No Conscription Fellowship. It was formed to support those who objected to taking up arms. It was begun by Finner Brockway, an independent editor of the Independent Labour Party of Great Britain. He put an appeal out in the newspaper, and it was made up of both political objectionists like socialists and religious objectionists such as Quakers, Congregationalists, Methodists, who made up this entity. And it pushed very hard to not have a conscription law in Great Britain. It actually, when the conscription came effect, it actually played a very vital role in getting a conscience clause put into the Great British Conscription Act of 1916. And after the conscription became law, the No Conscription Fellowship became an organization to support the conscience objector. It kept very meticulous records, as it says, of the person, where they lived, all the way down the line. And we'll look at that a little bit more. So in 1915, British casualties was approximately 285,000 men. These were all volunteers. That's a very large amount of men. And this was getting out in the news that, hey, this was not going very well. So what happens then? The volunteers start to decline. And the British Empire realized this is not a good thing. We're not getting enough men to keep us going. So Britain did two things in 1915 to try to address this problem. First, they did the National Registration Act of 1915, an act for the compilation of a national register that would be formed of all persons, male and female, between the ages of 15 and 65. So they more or less did what we would call a census. And then Lord Derby, who was also part of the Secretary of the State of War, and one of the people involved with enlistment, made a group system, he called it. Instead of you being asked to enlist and join right away as an individual person, you could go to the recruiting office and sign your name, giving more or less a promise or a pledge that you will join when you're called up. And they tried to normally get a large group of men who would all sign that same pledge, and they'd call you up all together. You would not just join individually. It did bring a few more people in, but it did not stop the decline of the voluntary enlistment. So, what happened? The United Kingdom passed a Conscription Act, Military Service Act of January 27th, 1916. Here is a zoom-in of what the act is, and we'll look at it. I'll zoom in so we can read it. This is from the United Kingdom Parliament legislation. I'm just going to read this top one because it's kind of interesting, because we're used to it. We'll start here. An act to make provision with respect to military service in connection with the present war, 27th of January, 1916. We'll zoom in a little bit more. Okay, I thought that would do that. We'll zoom in after I read that first sentence. So I thought it was interesting how British legislation is written compared to the United States. Being enacted by the King's most excellent majesty, bind with the advice and consent of Lords spiritual and temporal and commons in the same present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. And here's where they're doing the conscription or draft. On the every male subject who on the 15th day of August 1915 was ordinarily resident in Great Britain and has obtained the age of 18 years and had not obtained the age of 41 years. So you have to be at least 18 and young under 41. And there was a second condition. On the second day of November 1915, you were unmarried. So this initial draft did not do married men. Or was a widower without any child dependent on him. Shall, unless he is within the exception set out in the first schedule to this act, or has attained the age of 41 years before the appointed date, be deemed as from the appointed date to have been duly enlisted in His Majesty's regular forces for general service with the color or in the reserve for the period of the war, and to have forthwith transferred to the reserve. So that's, as far as I can tell, it drafted everybody. The United States, we had a draft lottery in 1917. You registered and you were chosen by lottery. Here it looks like, as far as I can tell, everybody was drafted if you were between those age periods. Except it says there's a schedule that you can get an exemption, and we will look at that. So, zooming into that schedule, I'm going to read starting at number 2 and read down a little bit. This is talking about some of the exemptions. An application may be made at any time before the appointed date to the local tribunal established under this act by and respect of any man for the issue to him of a certificate of exemption from the provisions of this act. And that's very important, that certificate of exemption. And here's the 4 reasons you can get a certificate. On the grounds that it is expedient in the national interest, that he should, instead of being engaged in the military service, be engaged in other work. So if you're doing something very important, you can get an exemption if it's of national significance. B, on the ground that serious hardship would ensue if the man were called for the army service owing to his exceptional financial or business obligation or domestic position. You could get an exemption if it was going to cause severe hardship to you and your family. C, on the ground of ill health or infirmity. They could give an exemption if you were sick, and that happened. And the 4th one that we're going to be looking at most today, on the ground of a conscientious objection to the undertaking of combatant service. And the local tribunal, if they consider the grounds of the application established, shall grant such a certificate. So there we have it. That, and I said that no conscription fellowship played a vital role in getting that one in there, getting a conscientious objection. But if you notice, it says from combatant service, the same thing that the United States had. They could give you an exemption in combat service. So we'll now zoom into that exemption in combat service. It's still from that same Act of Parliament, where the red box is. It says, any certificate of exemption may be absolute, conditional, or temporary, as the authority by whom it was granted think best suited to the case. And also in the case of an application on conscientious grounds may take the form of an exemption from combatant service only, or may be conditional or on the applicant being engaged in some work which is, in the opinion of the tribunal, dealing with the cases of national importance. So we'll just skip and look now at this tribunal. Okay, sorry. We'll look at all the exceptions they give that you cannot be drafted. And here they are. Man ordinarily resident in His Majesty's dominion abroad or resident Great Britain for the purpose only of their education. So if you're here, if you're not a resident of Great Britain, you wouldn't be drafted, or you're here from when they're provinces or colonies for studies, you wouldn't be drafted. Then they have members of His Majesty's regular or reserve forces, men serving the Navy or the Royal Marine, men in holy orders or regular ministers of any religious denomination, men who have left or been discharged from the naval or military service of the Crown in consequence of disablement or ill health. And the bottom one, which we'll be looking at, like I said, in detail today, men who hold a certificate of exemption under this act for the time being in force, other than a certificate of exemption from combatant service only, or who have offered themselves for enlistment and been rejected since the 14th day of August 1915. And I just caught that when I was studying this. You get a certificate of exemption from combatant service only. You're not exempt from this overall thing. You're still required to come. If you read that, you're not exempt from it. You were exempt from combatant, but you're not exempt from the draft. So here's what it says. This is a poster that they had. Military Service Act 1916. Any man who has an adequate grounds for applying to a local tribunal for a certificate of exemption under this act must do so before Thursday, March 2nd, 1916. Now the tribunal was just like we had in the United States. We had draft boards, and at the draft board, you as a conscious objector would give him your information there at the draft board. It's the same idea as the tribunal. It was made up of the local men of your community. It usually had a military representative on it. Occasionally, you would have virtually no time to present your case, like 1 or 2 minutes. Sometimes they give you maybe 10, 15 minutes, depending who you were. And they more or less had the ultimate authority of you if you got granted an exemption. So, as I said, that's just looking at that. Now we're going to skip to, if you saw the exemption said from combatant service only. They created at virtually the same time in early March, Army Order 112 of 10th of March 1916, that's where they write their dates in Great Britain, authorized the formation of the non-combatant corps under the royal warrant. Many matters relating to the establishment of the corps were dealt with in ACI 551 of 11th of March 1916. And this is what the non-combatant corps would do. Men accepted for service who hold a certificate of exemption from combatant service will be appointed by the area commander to the non-combatants corps. Companies will be trained in squad drill, without arms, and the use of various tools used in field engineering. Privates will be equipped as infantry, but not armed. So so non-combatant corps was under the Army's authority, just like we had in the United States when we had the non-combatant stuff that was defined by President Wilson in 1918. So these are 2 charts. In Great Britain, just like the United States, there's an estimate of how many conscious objectors there were. There's not an exact number, the same as we had here. So these charts, you can't see it, but these charts were based on more like 14 or 15, 16,000. The current research says there's closer to 20,000 conscious objectors, give or take, somewhere in that area in Great Britain. This blue says it's approximately 50% religious objection. You had 2% unknown objection, 1% non-sectarian, and political objection would be 46%. Like I said, that's based on about 14,000 people. It's more like 20,000. So the religious objection in Great Britain was, at least, as far as I can tell, over half of the conscious objectors. Here's a chart that just gives a breakdown of some of this person's research of some of the different types of religious. You had agnostic, Anglican, apostolic, Baptist, and then in Wesleyan, which would be Wesleyan Methodist. And his chart showed 8,200 approximately, but like I said, these numbers these are approximate numbers. So we will just look at what the Great Britain thought of conscious objectors. These are authentic posters from Great Britain. And just look at that poster. We'll read it. The conscious objector at the front. So you have the Hun, this weakling-looking guy is the conscious objector. Read what he says. "Oh, you naughty, unkind German, really, if you don't desist, I'll forget I've got a conscience and smack you on the wrist." Like as they're making fun of the conscious objectors. Two more of the same idea. The conscious objector at the front, seeing the British soldiers firing their guns, and they have these wimpy-looking people tidying up. It says, while the shot and shell are flying and the mighty cannons boom, he is tidying up the trenches with a dustpan and a broom. Again, making fun of conscious objectors. The final one, a row of Germans charging with their bayonets, and those guys singing their songs, and it says, you made me love you. Conscious objectors. The gentlemen with conscience require no swords or guns. They're going to win the war by singing love songs to the Huns. Like I said, these are authentic posters from Great Britain World War I time. So, just like in the United States, we had conscious objectors in the United States who were absolutists, who refused to do any type of work, that mean military or non-combatant or any type of alternative service. They'd be called absolutists. Now, I've shared some about those before. The Hutterites, those Hutterite brethren who persecuted and then dying in Fort Leavenworth, Vern Kessler, Maurice Hess, who were both German Baptists, and there were others. They would be considered absolutists who refused to do anything. You also had the alternativist who would do non-combatant work, in this case in the non-combatant corps, or serve as possibly the ambulance unit. In Great Britain, you had an ambulance unit under the military, and you had one that was that was under the Friends ambulance unit, which Friends being Quakers. Or you could perform work of significance, such as working in a hospital, agriculture, or vital manufacturing type thing. In Great Britain, as I said, there was about 20,000 conscious objectors. The numbers aren't exact, but they're saying there was probably 1,500 or so who were absolutists who served some type of thing in prison, in and out, during the war. They sometimes were in and sometimes they were out. Maybe 10 to 13,000, depending where you look, of people who did some type of alternative service for national work of national significance, 5 or so thousand of non-combatant corps, and just a few hundred who got absolute exemption from being in the military at all. So you had that big thing, and they only gave a few hundred absolute exemption. Like I said, there's not an exact number. I even called there to see if anybody had an exact number, and the person I talked to said no. So here's two quotes from two American conscious objectors who wrote about this idea of being absolutist, and I would agree with their quote. The first one, Ezra Dieter wrote to his parents saying, "A person has got to refuse any work at all or he is a goner." That's a very similar one by this Alan Christoffel. The further you went with the military official, the further they demanded one to go. The further I went, the less reason I could give for stopping. So I concluded the best place to stop was the beginning. Okay. Sorry, I just have to refresh my memory. So I want to look at two specific British conscious objectors who were absolutists, who were Christians. One was Norman Gaudy. He was of the Congregationalist Church. He had a very powerful testimony of non-resistance and following Jesus. And the other was by a man named John Hubert, which went by Bert Brocklesby, of the Wesleyan Methodists. Again, he had a very powerful testimony, I would say, of non-resistance and loving your enemies. I'm going to mostly focus on those two, but it's going to also include other conscious objectors as well because the story is all intertwined. So we're going to look at just a brief quote from Norman Gaudy. As I said, he was a Congregationalist who was applied for absolute exemption. And here's about 3 sentences from his claim for absolute exemption that he gave to the tribunal. I think it's pretty powerful. Let's just read it. "My objection to participation in the prosecution of war in any form whatsoever is based on the ground that to do so be a denial of my faith and belief in the fatherhood of God as revealed in the teachings of Jesus Christ. I therefore claim absolute exemption in accordance with the provisions of the Military Service Act No. 2, having the deep conviction that to change my activities other than by the dictate of conscience would conflict with the profound belief I have." Okay. So, as I said, they were absolute conscious objectors, the ones I'm going to look at. So they refused to do anything, just like when we read those stories before. These men, they didn't want to put a uniform on. They didn't really want to take orders. They didn't want to do anything around the military barracks. So And they like I said, Norman Gaudy and these others all got combatant exemption as far as I can tell, and they were transferred to the non-combatant corps, which they didn't want to work in there either because it was still under the military control. So let's start with this video here. And to kind of set the stage here with what happens. So what happened is these 16 men, I'm talking about too specific, but there were 14 others. We'll look at all their names. All ended up being transferred to the non-combatant corps at the 2nd Northern Company, which was stationed at Richmond Castle. Richmond Castle still exists today. It was formed somewhere at the time of the Normans, so it's that old, and it was used in World War I as a headquarters for a non-combatant corps. These men, as it said, because they refused to obey, were put in the cell block, like the old type dungeons that you would think of, and were held there. Some of the stories that I read about them, as we just look at these people, I will go and share their names. Here's we go. They were known as the Richmond 16. Among the conscious objectors detained at Richmond Castle were the men who became known as the Richmond 16. They included Wesleyan Methodists, that would be like Bert Brocklesby, Congregationalists such as Norman Gaudy, a Quaker, International Bible students, later known as Jehovah's Witnesses, a lay reader, and socialists. And when I counted, it was approximately 12 men who were there from churches or other religious organizations, and there were 4 there of the Richmond 16, 4 there for political objections, such as the socialists. So let's read their name and just share that, and we'll give a couple stories there. So we start with Norman Gaudy. He was a Congregationalist. Alfred Martlow of the Independent Labor Party, Alfred Meyer, a Wesleyan Methodist, Charles Ernest Creer, a socialist, John Hubert Burt Brocklesby, a Wesleyan Methodist who later became a Quaker, Leonard Ritten, part of the International Bible Student Association, Charles Rowland Jackson, also of the International Bible Student Association, Robert Armstrong Lown of the Independent Labor Party, Clifford Cartwright, part of the Church of Christ, Charles Herbert Sr. of the International Bible Student Association, Ernest Chalito Spencer, a Quaker, Clarence Hall of the International Bible Students Association, Stafford Hall, also the International Bible Student Association, William Edwin Law, it doesn't say, but he was part of the No Conscription Fellowship, which virtually all country objectors were part of, Hubert George Law, a Congregationalist, John William Routledge, a lay reader. Here's some of the stories that I heard what happened at Richmond Castle. So most of them were in a solitary confinement. All 16, it's a real castle. That is a picture of Richmond Castle from the day. So it was a real castle. It still exists, and we will look at some more stuff of what the men did there. So one of the things they did is they drew pictures on the wall in their cell. Those pictures still exist today, and we'll be looking at some of them. They also, as it said, when Bert Brocklesby was put in solitary confinement, there was a little hole. I'm not sure if it was an old grate or whatever it was, but there was a little hole, and he was looking at it, and the grate moved back, and Norman Gaudy was on the other side, so they actually were able to visit between each other, and they actually played chess through a small board. Norman Gaudy had snuck a little pocket chessboard with him into there, and they actually played chess to keep themselves afresh. So, Bert Brocklesby, from his testimony, says this is what one of his conversations he had with one of the military officials. We will look at that. So the top line is the military official, then Bert's answer. This is what's given there at Richmond Castle. So here it goes. The top, like I said, is the military official asking, and the next one's Bert. So it starts with, why are you a conscious objector? War is breaking the command, thou shalt not kill. Do you think that those commands apply to individuals but not to the state? They apply to both. Are you a Christian? Yes. There are thousands of Christians in the war. It's not my idea of being a Christian. I think that's a very powerful testimony to tell the war person, like I said, a military official, it's not my idea of being a Christian. Because that, as we, just like the United States and Great Britain and Germany all said it, that war was holy, this is a righteous cause, and no, war is not holy, and war is not a righteous cause. Okay, so there's a picture of Richmond Castle, and I said all the slides showing a castle in my thing come from that castle. Like I said, it still exists today. You can tour it. You have to have special permission to tour where the men were there because it's an older part and they're worried about that part, the drawings rotting away type thing. So what happened to those men? On May 29, 1916, those 16 men were released from the castle, which would be, I would think that should be good news. They were, were they being sent to like other prisons? And the answer was no. It was actually bad news. And now this is why. We'll read this telegram. This is a copy of a telegram sent by Arthur Roundtree, MP, being member of Parliament, because it's mentioned many times. We don't think of that. For York, being York, United Kingdom, not the York, Pennsylvania, on the 29th May 1916, to his brother-in-law Thomas Edmund Harvey, a Leeds MP or member of Parliament. So this is what the telegram says. We'll zoom in a little bit. If you're close, you might be able to read it. If you're further away, you can't. So I will read it out loud. So, to Edmund Harvey, and this says Commons, have just wired McKenna as follows. My cousin, visiting Richmond yesterday, reports 16 conscious objectors under detention refusing military duties or ordered France Tuesday with non-combatant corps. Surely sending these 16 contrary to arrangement made with War Office. Trust you can stop this immediately. Have not wired Tennant. Thought it better with you. See him if you can this afternoon and urge importance. Coming up tonight, Arnold. So like I said, this is a telegram saying these men, instead of being released and kept in the United Kingdom or England, were transferred to Boulogne, France, across the English Channel. There was a army camp of non-combatant corps located there. Tennant is the Undersecretary of State of War, and I will be mentioning him a lot here in this discussion just to help so you know who I'm referring to. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to Boulogne, France. And in Boulogne, France, from Bert Brocklesby's testimony, we're going to look at his testimony. So here's what his testimony says. I'm sorry, sometimes got mixed up here. So this Bert Brocklesby's testimony, this is beginning of June 1916. Let's read it. The commanding officer told us that we're now in active service. The penalty refusing to obey orders was death. In the United States, they only condemned a couple conscious objectors to death. So Bert's getting warned by the commanding officer, you better obey or you get sentenced to death. He would give us 24 hours to think it over. It's pretty strong. So later that day, they were actually given freedom. The conscious objectors on all these places were actually given freedom, a lot more freedom than they gave in the United States. So the men were more or less under house arrest idea, but they were able to go through Boulogne, and they went to a coffee shop or something, and they were all chatting, so they weren't locked in a jail type thing. And here's what Bert asked the other men. This is a very famous quote. How far are you prepared to go? Bert asked Leonard Ritten. To the last ditch, said he, and one by one they all said the same, referring to that thing. How far are we willing to go? Are we going to obey the military? They just threaten us. If we don't, we can be sentenced to death. You might think that's an idle threat, but it's not. This slide, we're going to read briefly from the British Military Law, Army Act of 1881. We'll zoom in a little bit. An act to consolidate the Army Discipline and Regulation Act 1879. This would be under Queen Victoria's time. And we'll just read in exactly what they're referring to, right here where the red is. Every person subject to military law who commits the following offense, that is to say, disobeys in such manner as to show a willful defiance of authority, any lawful command given personally by his superior officer in the execution of his office, whether the same is given orally or in writing or by signal or otherwise, shall on conviction by court-martial be liable to suffer death. So it's not an idle threat. In fact, about 3 weeks earlier, driver John William Hassemore of the British Army died 12th of May 1916, age of 23 years, executed for disobedience. So it wasn't an idle threat. They had this, like I said, about 3 weeks earlier, executed somebody for disobedience, disobeying orders. So now we're going to skip to the Parliament so we can actually see what's happening there. Mr. Roundtree, the same person that came from that Parliament, from that telegram, this is from the Parliament records on 1st of June 1916, says, by private notice, I beg to ask the Undersecretary of State of War that is Tennant, whether it is true that the 16 men from Richmond and others from Albertville, who on conscience grounds were resisting military orders, in spite of instructions to the contrary, were this week sent to France. If so, what steps have been taken to bring them back without delay? Mr. Tennant responds, he's reading from his telegram that he sent to France. Copy of telegram to the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Northern Command, 30th May. It is understood that there are 16 men of non-combatant corps now in detention or recently released at Richmond due to proceed to France with their unit today. These men are said to have committed offenses against discipline on account of conscientious objection. Take steps to ensure that they do not go to France, to remain to undergo sentence, or if released, or forthwith attached to another unit of the non-combatant corps. If they have already gone, take steps to recall if still in this country, or state whereabout as far as it is known. Now we're skipping down about 3 weeks. Mr. Harvey, the same person that telegram, asked whether this, now look, count them. If you count them all, there's approximately now 50 conscience objectors who were sent to France, if you count all the ones in this slide. Asked whether the 17 conscience objectors who were sent from the detention at Harwich to France at the beginning of May, the 8 objectors who were sent from Seaford on the 30th of May, that's 25, the 16 who were sent from Richmond on the 29th of May, that's 41, and those who were sent from Albertville on the 30th and 31st of May are still in France. At least 50 conscience objectors were sent from Great Britain to the non-combatant corps camp there in Boulogne, France. So, what happened next? Well, we're going to see. Here's what happens. This is what happened at a court-martial of one of the conscience objectors. You are sentenced to death by being shot. Just imagine you hearing that at an army camp with all the people lined up. And they have the dramatic, and they just read that. You come up to the front, and they pronounce by the court-martial, you are guilty, you are sentenced to death by being shot. But it doesn't stop there. How do you stop these? There we go. Can you stop this for me, Raleigh? No, it's gone. Good. Thank you. So what happens? Is it still beeping? But it doesn't end there. This is what happens. After that dramatic break, it says your sentence has been commuted to 10 years of penal service. So they sentence you to death, and then you have this dramatic break, and then they give you 10 years of penal service. So we're going to look at what this is referring to. I'm going to read a letter from one of the conscience objectors who this happened to. We're going to read the letter. This was from a newspaper, Manchester Guardian, June 24th, 1916. And we're going to read the letter from Howard C. Martin, who was a Quaker. Now we're going to start there at his letter on this next slide. On evening of Thursday, June 15th, I heard the result of the court martial. It read out the local camp before a large body of men. The court found me guilty of the charges brought against me and sentenced me to suffer death by being shot. This dramatic sentence, however, was commuted to one of penal service for 10 years. Similar sentences were passed on the 3 conscience objectors tried at the same time as myself. I am still at the FP barracks and have not heard anything as to when and where I shall be removed. Through all, I have been supported by a sense of the deepest peace and humble conscience of my own worthiness to bear my small share of testimony to the teachings of our dear Lord, and thankful for the blessing of His Holy Spirit. Naturally, I think long and often of all the dear ones and sincerely hope that before being confined to prison, I may be given the opportunity of seeing one or more of you. But as yet, I know nothing of the future, which I have trustfully and hopefully in the hands of our Father, in whose care I feel you all repose. So there's a letter from one who received that sentence. Well, what does Parliament say? So he was sentenced to death on June 17th. Well, Parliament, on the day of June 22nd, 5 days later, this Mr. Barnes asked the Undersecretary, Mr. Tennant, I desire to ask the Undersecretary a question of which I have been given notice. It is in reference to a report current in the lobbies tonight that 4 men in France have been sentenced to death. These men are stated to be conscientious objectors. So he's asking Mr. Tennant, did this really happen? This is what Mr. Tennant says. The Undersecretary of State of War, Mr. Tennant, many rumors with regard to the treatment of conscientious objectors have been circulated, and the great majority of them are untrue. This is only, I assume, one of those. That's how I think they'll too. It's like, you got to be kidding me that he doesn't think this is really happening. This is the Undersecretary of War. And he's saying, I don't think that really happened. Well, then let's look at some of these other things I've found. Cornelius Barrett, another conscience objector who was sentenced to death, was a Quaker, and his pay stub, you can't read it probably from the back, it says June 10th, 1916 on his pay stub, and in that little handwriting it says, sentenced to death, sentence commuted 10 years penal servitude by General Sir D. Haig. So there's a copy of a, like I said, slide for one of them showing that. This is what Norman Gowdy said at his court-martial testimony, knowing that I think that he most likely could be sentenced to death. He says, my motive for refusing is because my religious convictions prevent me from taking any part in the military system, whatsoever, and am therefore forced to disobey any military orders in loyalty to those convictions which are based on the spirit and teaching of Christ. So here's now on June 26th when they actually acknowledge what happened. So Mr. Morrell asked the Prime Minister, that would be Prime Minister Asquith, whether Private Howard Martin, the one we looked at his letter, and 3 other conscience objectors now serving in France, have been sentenced by court-martial to be shot, and if so, whether these sentences have been commuted. Mr. Tennant responds instead of the Prime Minister. He says, it is the case that court-martials held in France have, in the exercise of their judicial function, sentenced certain men professing conscience objection to death for offenses punishable by death under the Army Act we looked at. In all these cases, 34 in number, I am informed, the sentence has been commuted to penal servitude by the Commander-in-Chief in France. And of course, this news was in the newspaper. From the Cambridge Daily News, it shows that. The next page, conscience objectors, death sentence, and 34 men commuted to penal servitude. And actually, the current research says it was actually 35 men who were sentenced to death, not 34. But yes, they, and stuff. So, when I researched, I tried to figure out a little bit how did this all happen? And what they said happened is, and I'll show you the slide on the next one, that in May 1916, a delegation from the No Conscription Fellowship met with Prime Minister Asquith, and one of their concerns was the conscience objectors. And Prime Minister Asquith told the delegation this. He, being the Prime Minister Asquith, and this is what was recorded in their journal, says he assured the members of the deputation that the government did not intend the conscience objectors to become liable to the death penalty. The No Conscription Fellowship kept the Prime Minister in touch during the crisis, and he reciprocated. The Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, was directed that no conscience objector in France was to be shot for refusal to obey orders. And although the order was not made public, notice of it was at once given to Marshall. That's referring to Catherine Marshall, who was the secretary of the No Conscription Fellowship. So, the best of my information, the Prime Minister had told them that wasn't going to happen, but they didn't want to tell the public about this, because I'm not quite sure why, but they didn't want to tell the public, so it was kept a secret. So what happened to the men when they came back from France? Well, look, now we're going to look at that when they came back from France, and as we conclude the sermon here. So this is a copy of the Daily Mirror newspaper, another British newspaper. We're just going to look at a couple sentences that the Prime Minister says. Premier and more resignations. Mr. Asquith tells MP or the members of Parliament to await developments, release for objectors. Let's read what he says, and we're going to look at this. This is Mr. Asquith talking. In reply to a number of questions on conscience objectors, Mr. Asquith outlined the procedure which was being adopted under Army Order Number 10. He said that all men whose objection to active military service was founded in honest conviction ought to be able and would be able to avail themselves of the exemptions provided by Parliament. But men who put forward objections of this kind as a pretext and a cloak to cover their indifference to their responsibilities to the national call were therefore guilty of the double offense of cowardice and hypocrisy, and would be treated as they ought to be treated, with the utmost vigor. At the same time, when he made this announcement saying that you would be able to have your conscience, these guys were sent back from France, you'd be able to go to a more or less a national board, and you would have your application re-examined. The Home Office of Great Britain made what was called the Home Office Scheme that was intertwined with this, that if you were found as a sincere person and you didn't want to, quote, do non-combatant service, you could work in a work of national significance. and give you all, or something like that. And of course, some of the conscience objectors accepted that as as my figures, and the absolutists obviously did not. So one of the first things they did was the Dice work camp near Aberdeen, Scotland. When you mentioned that this morning, it was at an old quarry. And here's a picture. You probably can't see it very well in the back, but those in the front can. This picture shows 24 of the 35 men who were condemned to death there. And if you read them, you can recognize the name. Robert Lowndes, these are ones from Richmond. Robert Lowndes, Ernest Spencer, Charles Jackson, Clifford Cartwright, John Routledge, William Law, Norman Gowdy, Alfred Marlowe, John Hubert Brocklesby, Herbert Law, Howard Martin, the one that we read his letter, Howard Martin, Cornelius Barrett saw his pay stub, Harold Stanton was also a Quaker as well who was sentenced to death. What happened at this work camp is they were given old army equipment, and if you remember, Great Britain usually gets pretty rainy and all the time. Well, they were wet, which was obviously not that bad, but one of the conscience objectors who was sent there was already sick. He got wet, he got sicker, he got most likely pneumonia, and he died. His name was Robert Leslie Roberts, and with his death, the government shut this work camp down. Of course, they had other work camps, but like I said, the absolutists didn't always want to be at those work camps, so they ended up back in prison. Both Norman Gowdy and Bert Brocklesby ended up back at the Maidstone Civil Prison. It is estimated that approximately 100 conscience objectors died in Great Britain during World War I because of being sick or mistreated, something like that. When they did that home office scheme, it was mentioned that they wanted to make sure the conscience objectors had it as bad as the soldiers. They weren't going to purposely treat them bad, but they didn't want them to get that they were getting a couchy, easy job. The soldiers were in the trenches suffering. You're going to have to suffer too. We're not. That it was very. They did not want. Quote, like I said, it made a lot of people upset about that. So one of the things I read as I was studying, most likely was the same United States prisons for conscience objectors, but a lot of British prisons enforced a rule of silence, that you were, as a conscience objector, were going to speak quiet to yourself in your cell, but you weren't going to see other people, or if you saw other people, you weren't supposed to talk to them. Now you imagine being in solitary confinement for 1 or 2 years, talking to virtually nobody. It said they said because of that they would talk to the bugs and like the spiders or what have you in their thing, because God created us to have interaction. So they were purposely not having interaction with other people. They were allowed to talk, I think maybe Sunday afternoon, but it was not very often. And Bert said it, and I think of many of them, that when you came out of prison, and when they got finally released on August 12, 1919, it definitely affected them mentally, being the solitary confinement, not getting to talk to other people. So what happened when the conscience objectors were released? That's as we conclude this. Well, one of the things that happened, and I think it makes sense, these men who were either drafted or voluntarily enlisted to serve their country, like Great Britain, their countries want to make sure they get jobs when they come back. They had the same thing in the United States. They wanted to make sure the soldiers who came back to the United States had first preference for jobs. So here's some newspaper clippings that I found about discharged soldiers needing jobs. This first one, we'll just read the top paragraph. Employment of discharged soldiers. It says, at the meeting of the Farnsworth District Council on Tuesday evening, the Works Committee submitted a proclamation by His Majesty the King, together with circular and memorandum from the Ministry of Health, with reference to the employment of disabled officers and men, and recommended the Council to approve the Ministry's suggestion and authorize the clerk to sign undertaking on behalf of the Council to make every possible effort to provide suitable employment for as many disabled servicemen as possible, which will be not less than 5%. So it's even in the news that you employ discharged soldiers. Here's a similar one. Ex-soldiers demand work. Deputation to the Lord Mayor protests against female employment, and that's referring to the fact that when the men left, the women got their jobs, just like what happened in the United States. So the men were complaining they want their jobs back. And this last one is specifically talking about conscience objectors having jobs that the soldiers don't like. And here it is from this newspaper, the Daily Mail. And we'll just look at, there we go. It says, work for conscience a protest. And conscience was a derogatory term, and they use that, I think, in the United States as well. Protests were made at the meeting of Weymouth Employment Committee yesterday by the Portland Urban District Council and the comrades of the Great War Branch against the employment of conscientious objectors on whitewashing and carpeting at Portland, thereby displacing discharged soldiers. Both Norman and Bert had the same issue, and I read, virtually all kinds of objectors had the same issue of getting jobs back. Bert had been a school teacher, and everywhere he went and he applied to school, when they found out he had been a conscientious objector, asked to leave. He finally got some jobs. It was like they say he tried to work at a deaf school. He worked there a week. They saw on his resume, conscientious objector, you need to move on. It happened, like I said, and Norman had the same issue, but he finally got work, but it was like a year or two after the fact. I want to just conclude with a statement, and we're going to watch a video here. This video was from Richmond Castle, but the statement I thought was one of the things I got felt so challenging about this is if you think about Bert Brocklesby from the Wesleyan Methodist, Norman Gowdy from the Congregationalists, those are two conventional churches that don't teach that war is wrong. So where did they get that conviction? In my mind, it's because they read their Bible. They saw the clear teaching of Jesus in the New Testament that war is wrong, that Christians love their enemies. We do not take up arms. And I think that is a very powerful testimony for knowing our Bible, for reading our Bible, for being willing to take a stand. Like I said, they took a stand against virtually their whole church. There were a couple hundred conscientious objectors in both the Wesleyan Methodist and the Congregationalists, but very small amount. So we're going to conclude with this video. This video was done, it's the completion of that first video when we heard them marching. It's of Richmond Castle itself, and they are reading different graffiti or drawings that were on the wall. So when you look at it, it's video of the castle, more or less dungeons, where the Richmond 16 were kept. So we will look at that and we will conclude.
Men, materials, and money are the immediate necessities. Does the call of duty find no response in you until reinforced by the call of compulsion? Enlist today.
Your home and country need you, so hear the cry today.
Come be a man and take a gun and keep the foe at bay.
We are convinced that war is wrong. We must put conscience first. And for our conscience' sake we're held to ridicule and scorn.
If I were to smite you on the cheek, would you turn the other?
That is our Christian duty, sir.
Would your conscience prevent you from striking the enemy down?
I would certainly not strike them down. No man is justified in taking life.
So if you were attacked by Germans, would you kill to save your own life?
No, sir.
Every cross grows light beneath the shadow, Lord, of thine.
The only war which is worth fighting is the class war. The working class of this country have no quarrel with the working class of Germany or any other country.
Is England a free country? Well, let us go. Let the MPs fight it out. Let's be free and look after our wives and children.
If ye love me, keep my commandments. Thou shalt not kill.
You may as well die for a principle as for the lack of one.
How far are you prepared to go?
Okay, so that concludes my sermon.